generally my presentations to these students would focus on literacy, why I love learning, and we would write collaboratively. I often brought a big crate of stuffed animals, and we would turn them into characters and name them, and this is how I would try to get other young people engaged in writing stories. So I went from being a champion for literacy for the Verizon Foundation and speaking widely on issues around writing to teaching more widely, giving presentations on leadership, and actually I began speaking at education conferences, including what was then NECC, the National Education Computing Conference, and then they renamed it ISTE after the organization, so more focusing on tech and education. And next, in March actually, I'm going to be at South by Southwest EDU in Austin. Is anyone here going to that? South by. Oh, awesome. Sweet, maybe we'll see each other. So I'm going to be on a panel with Nikhil Goyal, who's like another really big education reform dude, and he's around my age. He gives speeches even more widely than I do, I think. I've spoken at around 100 conferences around the world, probably 27 states and 15 countries, and I believe that that has been one of my most valuable learning experiences so far. Probably I've learned more from some weeks of going to these conferences and traveling and soaking up local culture than I have in certain weeks of high school, which is hopefully not too blasphemous. And I'm hoping that we can change it so that every student has an...
So I'm just really interested to hear your perspective on that.
Cool. Yeah, I'm really interested in policy, so okay, so I guess we'll get started. And I apologize for this random image about recently transitioned veterans, which I'm assuming is extraordinarily interesting, that is up behind me. It has absolutely nothing to do with the topic of my talk. Unfortunately, no.
Can we turn it off?
On a dark and stormy evening, that's more for the drama of it. But this is Seattle we're talking about, so yeah, dark and stormy is probably true. And I was staring at this photo, stalking my friends, as I often do. It was a photo of a bunch of people smiling. They're in a pretty official wood-paneled building looking a little bit like this. They have their arms around each other. It's maybe 10 or 11 people. And they have big smiles. They look joyful, maybe even joyfully smug, because what they are is National Merit Scholars, and they're about to receive a commendation from my school district for doing extraordinarily well on the PSAT. And this group of students will get the absolute best that life can hand them. A bunch of them are my friends, so I know that they've already gotten into the top colleges of their choice, many Ivy Leagues. They've gotten into prestigious summer research programs. They've won tens of thousands of dollars in scholarships. And in this photo, they really stand on the precipice of taking control of their lives, and I think that in that picture, they're owning it. So let's backtrack a little and ask, how did they get there? Well, when they were around 6 years old, or 12 years old, depending on when they took the test, they went to elementary school with a little bit more trepidation than usual, and their parents told them, you better do really well on this because this decides so much of your future. And it was a test to see whether they would be in the gifted and talented program of my school district, and they scored within the top 5%. And because of that, then they entered Quest, which was the Exalted Gifted program. So then they went into high school with a knowledge base that was a grade level higher than most of their general ed counterparts, and because of that, they slid into honors and AP classes like they were born for them. And they got 4.0s, straight A's, and it felt easy to many of them. They took 6 or 7 AP classes a year, maybe even more online. I know some people who have taken 8 in a given year and have basically just maxed out. And on one day in October, they went to school with a little more nervousness than usual. Seems like deja vu. And they took another test, this one national, called the PSAT. And that brings them to that picture where they have their arms around each other, smiling, because yet again, they scored in the top percentile. Well, their story is the story of more than 10 teenagers in a room smiling. It's the story of a large and privileged class of teenagers around the nation. It's the story of students who know what hoops they have to jump through, and jump through them with a choreography that would make gymnastics Olympians proud or jealous. I used to believe that these students earned those high scores and joyful smiles because they were the hardest working, because they put everything they had into it, because they wanted it the most. That merit meant merit. And today, I wonder, even as much as I love those people, as much as they are some of the smartest people that I know, I wonder if we overestimate what testing can tell us about any given person's qualifications, whether it's for the best schools, the best jobs, or the best lives. And I wonder if we have fallen too deeply in love with the idea of merit that we can quantify and that it's easy to reduce to simple numbers and terms. Most importantly, I wonder what we can do to change this, how we can create true partnerships between students and teachers so that the education reform discussion is more than one that is always top-down, that is dictated entirely by new standards and how to meet those standards. So my hope is that today you will walk away with the idea that merit needs to be expanded beyond mere smartness, that this isn't our singular definition of merit, and it needs to be expanded into the many areas of excellence that represent the diversity of a given population and the diversity of needs in an economy. And three of the ways that I propose we do this from a student perspective are kickstarting more student voice in education reform. This is something that I've been extraordinarily passionate about over the course of working with students and as someone who speaks widely myself. By giving students more opportunities for independent and passion-driven learning within the context of their schools, as well as out-of-school learning experiences. And we need to create more variety in the courses and tracks that are offered to students from all socioeconomic backgrounds, so it's not just the poor kids in the city getting vocational ed and the rich kids in the suburbs getting the best academic courses, but really a mix of both for both folks. So I began by talking about those friends who are national merit scholars and how they got there with a test. And they're not the only ones who take a lot of tests, because ours is an age of relentless testing. By the time I graduate from high school, I will have taken 10 AP tests, 3 SATs, and 2 SAT subject tests. I am by no means the most in any of those categories. As I said, I know people who have taken like 15 APs, taken the SAT 4 or 5 times, and maybe 4 subject tests. So if you think that there's like a high level, there's always someone who's willing to go higher than that. In many districts, students will take adaptive assessments to help drive data-driven practices, which is honestly a mumbo-jumbo of words that my parents and most students for that matter are not exposed to and don't understand and are thus not equipped to argue with or to question. I think that one of the issues with testing is that it really gives people this impression that after something is learned that you can be sorted into a false binary of successes and failures. And I see this most evident, especially in high school students, when there is a big test tomorrow and they're stressing out about some arbitrary threshold. If they get less than a 90, they're a failure, and if you get more than a 90, you're a success, or whatever your personal standard might be. And I found it really poignant when one of my friends posted on Facebook, why do we look at it that way? Why is only an A good enough, or why is only a B good enough? If I get a 75% on a test, that means that I mastered 3/4 of the material, right? And that's the majority. Shouldn't that be good enough? And we're always chasing after this good enough, especially as a student from a fairly high-performing school district, and it feels like that good enough is continually receding further and further out of reach. Unfortunately, what I see happening because of this is that students automatically associate test-taking with learning, as if only that which can be trotted out and performed on a test is worth learning. But there's a tremendous issue with that, which is the fact that the most valuable lessons we learn in life cannot be reduced to easy, succinct questions with A through E answers. Take a moment to think about the number one most important lesson someone has taught you or that you've learned in your life, inside or outside of school. Think about how it happened, maybe what moment taught you that, how it's impacted you today. And now try to write an SAT-style question around that lesson. I personally know that there is no way I or even the best test writers in this world could do that. Because we're talking about questions of ethics and morality and difficult decisions and interpersonal relationships, the kinds of things that we don't really learn in school and the kinds of things that inevitably determine a great deal of our future and how people react to us. But unfortunately, because they're not the types of things that are tested, I think that many students walk away with the idea that they're not the type of things that we value. So there's definitely a link. For me as a student, I see this between what is on the test and what is valued. I mean, any of you who have been in a high school classroom and seen that person who raises the hand and says, "Excuse me, Mrs. So-and-so or Mr. So-and-so, is this on the test tomorrow?" And I think that that's a really pervasive attitude because our intrinsic motivation and our natural desire to learn has been so eroded over time. I found it really interesting throughout my reading that contrary to popular belief, events with high stakes that provide really damaging disincentives for performing badly or very high rewards for performing well, those actually are not the most effective ways to get people to perform. It seems contrary, but like if I told you try to make a cool freestanding structure out of spaghetti sticks with a marshmallow on top, this is a legit thing called the marshmallow challenge. People who attempted that actually did significantly worse when they were offered money as a reward, because suddenly they had this tunnel vision, oh my god, I have to get this thing to stand up, I have to make the highest one, etc., because they really wanted the money involved. When you just allowed them to explore freely within the time given, much as kindergarten students did, then they actually did much better. They weren't thinking of this distracting reward, basically, and they were just trying to figure things out. And the author Daniel Pink, who has written really widely on business topics, some who might have seen his speeches, he talks a lot about the value of non-commissioned work. That's what he calls it. He writes about how some of the most innovative things that have come out of companies like FedEx and Google have happened on the 20% time, basically the free time that is given to employees to come up with whatever they want. Things like Gmail, which I'm guessing a lot of you might have. In Gmail, yeah, Google Maps, which I personally use to find Teachers College today. And many other things happened while someone was basically just doing whatever they wanted, which is an incredibly powerful thing to me, because I would have thought that really, really cool things only happen when you give someone money or you give someone a decent reward. But then I thought about my own life, and how the coolest, most fun things I do are never the ones anyone gives me money for. I mean, I'm a crappy runner, so no one would pay me money per hour to go run the half marathon I'm doing in March, but I am really enjoying training for it. At least that's what I lie to myself afterwards. So the point is that the non-commissioned work we do can be some of the most valuable, but increasingly we are seeing less and less of that non-commissioned work, in the sense that students are being confronted with higher and higher stakes of tests. It's a continual system of here's a reward for success, or here's a loss for failure. And I think that when students are doing what they themselves consider to be rewarding, to make sense, and to be even lastingly fun within school, that we can see better results. I think that I speak to the majority of students when I say that bubbling in Scantrons is not what someone would pick if you gave them the choice. It's not something that most people consider fun. But one of the criticisms that I've heard of criticisms of testing culture, yeah, pretty meta criticism of criticism, is that there aren't enough alternatives being offered, that people just put their hands up and complain without giving another option. Well, I've been really lucky this year to have 2 great classes where I have seen other options in progress. I got put into a class called Computer Science and Engineering. I say I got put into it because I had to have 1 occupational credit, and I was like, oh my god, I'm going to be the only girl. Whole other problematic area there, by the way, girls instead. But I wasn't super enthused. But then I walked into this class and I realized, whoa, this guy who's our teacher is super chill, and we don't have tests. He basically says, 1, as soon as you have an idea for an independent project that you can write a proposal about and get approved, then you are free. You don't have to do the regular curriculum. You can just pursue your independent project, and we will get you funding and materials if necessary. The second thing is that to demonstrate mastery of a given lesson, and it's not like checking boxes off or bubbling things in. I had to put my robot down on the ground and show that it could do a 180 and play music and other cool stuff. To me, that was incredibly empowering, because I had a sense of pride in putting that robot there and seeing it do a really bad turn versus, okay, it was a decent turn, versus actually just getting 90% on a test. And that was something that felt more authentic. My second class that I really enjoyed is something called Global Health. It's a 3-period block, and it was a pilot program just launched by my school this year to provide an experience similar to a freshman course in university. So we have a lot of time where we're just reading journal articles and writing papers and doing stuff that a lot of my classmates in other classes don't really do. And what's awesome about that is I can't remember the last time we did a standard multiple choice test. Instead, we do problem-based learning assessments where we're given a problem. For instance, lack of rural access to clean water in Afghanistan, and we have to then come up with solutions or test out which solutions work best. So we did a lab where we got to pick different methods of filtration, whether it was pouring water through a sari or using chlorine. There was something called the life straw, and we compared all this. We did cost-benefit analysis. I would honestly say that I put way more work into that PBL than I ever had put into studying for a test the night before. But it was work that I did not mind doing, which I found to be the really crucial part. So those are alternatives, I think. We have assessments that are more work-based, that are more performance-based, as opposed to assessments that are very much just this one time you get it wrong or right on a bubble sheet. At some point, I think that tests like that become dehumanizing. Dehumanizing because they strip away that most basic of human characteristics, which is the one that drives babies to chew everything in sight and 3-year-olds to ask, why is the sky blue and why are leaves green? Curiosity. We're born with curiosity. It's necessary for our survival. It's necessary for how we learn growing up. And yet you see that as kids go through school, they seem to become less and less curious. I've seen this myself because I would go to these elementary schools and I would speak to kindergartners and first graders, and their hands were always up in the air, like super high, trying to touch the ceiling kind of stuff. And they wanted to ask questions, and they wanted to throw out adjectives when we were doing stories, and they just wanted to talk, and they were full of energy and why, and question marks. I could see them like floating off of them as if it were a cartoon. And then I would go and talk to 9th graders, 10th graders, 11th graders, and you see a bunch of kids who are just like sitting. I mean, I've been in this position myself, and they're kind of like, okay, maybe not that solemn looking, but I have been that kid. I am that kid on some days in like AP Bio, because that's what happens when you feel like your questions no longer have value, or your questions don't have a place in a classroom that continually tells you that the only questions worth answering are the ones written by a teacher or written by a test bank, whoever writes those mysterious things. And when it comes to curiosity, I know I hit rock bottom the night before I had this massive 100-point test on photosynthesis, and photosynthesis is just, we are not homies. I got to a point where I've said, okay, you know, plants, I don't care that I eat you, like, you can stop with the whole photosynthesis thing. And that night, I was glowering tearfully at this page, this packet, and my dad walks in at the wrong place, wrong time, and says, hey, do you know what the isotopes involved? That was when I snapped. I snapped, and I said, if it's not on the test, I don't care. Much more loudly than that. What was so distressing about that moment, what made me feel like something within me had truly died in that moment, was the fact that it was so different from who I knew I was. I was never that girl who raised her hand and said, is this going to be on the test tomorrow? And I was never that girl who on Friday nights had dates with my sexy pile of flashcards. I was just not that person. Because I believed that there was, I guess, more to life to live than what was on the test tomorrow. And I did not have tiger parents who pressured me to get all A's, to borrow a term from Amy Schwab. Now sometimes I wish that I had my very own rent-a-tiger parent, because when I was filling out college apps, every fiber of me wished that for 4 years I had gotten straight A's and the best test scores. I wish that I had parents who had shuttled me to SAT prep classes instead of just giving me the $5 that I needed to buy a used book from a friend. I wish that I had parents who had told me I needed to do math classes over the summer and enrichment classes online in the fall, instead of parents who accepted that I was simply going to do Algebra 2, yes, Algebra 2, while my friends were doing AP Calc. And I wish that I had parents who said no more absences from school instead of letting me travel to those 27 states and 15 countries, learning so much more in some weeks than I ever had in school. Or wait, do I really wish that I had had those alternate universe parents? I'm glad that I had the parents I had, and not just because my mom is sitting over there. I'm glad that I had parents who were brave enough to reject, or perhaps clueless enough not to know, what it takes in an age of cutthroat competition and high-stakes testing to get into the most prestigious colleges, to become a National Merit Scholar, and all the rest. I'm glad that I had parents who never ordered me to stop reading my ridiculously gigantic piles of books that I got when I went on checkout sprees at the library. Most recently I got 17 books, including 2 on zoonotic diseases for whatever reason. And they never told me to stop reading so you can study for the test. My parents were brave, or clueless, but I'm not. And most school days provide me with these really hard fights between whether I want to read those books I've checked out, whether I want to learn something out of curiosity, or if I want to study something that is going to actually be on the test. The pressure of passing one test or another for so many students is kind of like the slowly rising fever in the back of your mind, because there's always one coming up next week, tomorrow, 2 weeks from now. I think that if it were one of those diseases they put on WebMD with super sensationalist consequences and stuff, if any of you looked up your symptoms on WebMD, you know this, then it would have as one of those symptoms tunnel vision. Because what happens is that everyone does ask, is this going to be on the test? And it cuts out opportunities or the value of discussion, of reading books that you checked out independently, and of learning things that you're interested in independently. So I was curious, with all this in mind, and assuming that people cannot have forgotten so quickly from their own days as students how miserable it is to just sit in rooms and take tons of tests, why are we nationally moving towards more testing? I did quite a bit of research on this, particularly on stuff that came out right after the passage of No Child Left Behind, and there's a really good story on PBS's Frontline that pointed out some of the facets of this educational industrial complex, particularly around testing. And it discussed the hundreds of millions of dollars being allotted by the federal government for standardized testing, including the fact that 96% of tests administered at the state level are written by 3 companies. Those companies are Harcourt, CTV McGraw-Hill, and Riverside Publishing, and then NCS Pearson is the leading scorer of all those standardized tests. And the really crazy part is that testing is a burgeoning industry, according to PBS. While test sales in 1955 were $7 million, that's adjusted to 1998 currency, then that figure was $263 million in 1997. $263 million in 1997. That's the year that I was born. So in the 16 years since then, I can imagine that there would easily be even more. The increase between 1955 and 1997, that was an increase of more than 3,000%. 3,000%. That's insane. To me, there's something wrong with that. There's something wrong with the fact that corporations have quietly woven themselves into the fabric of what we think makes up the tapestry of America's public education, testing. Diane Ravitch wrote a really good book, Tested, about this trend towards more and more national tests, state standards, etc. And she wrote, "The mission of public schools should not be to make money. Required to educate all citizens, public schools embody hard-won principles of equity and inclusion that are now in danger. The free market always favors those with more money and information, generating inequality." And Ravitch says that purported free market solutions have worked as distractions from the truly pressing problems of poverty and segregation by race and class, which impede learning and therefore should be the actual target of education and social reform. That we are distracted from the truly pressing problems of poverty and segregation by race and class is to me unsurprising considering how we currently define merit. Instead of truly rewarding hard work, more often than not we accidentally, I think, perpetuate long-held socioeconomic, geographic, and racial inequalities. So as an example, from right here in New York City, Hunter College High School, some of you might know, is a really elite secondary school that many kids want to get into, and it selects its entering class from the top percentile of test takers. And some years back, the faculty chose a student who was headed to Columbia, actually, to give their valedictorian address. And this student said quite a bit that you'd expect, said how much he loved the school and how much he missed people, etc., valedictorian addresses. And then he said something shocking, the type of thing that you never hear at valedictorian addresses, because those things are really boring most of the time. And he said this: "More than happiness, relief, fear, or sadness, I feel guilty. I feel guilty because I didn't deserve any of this, and neither do any of you. We received an outstanding education at no charge based solely on our performance on a test we took when we were 4-year-olds or 11-year-olds. We received superior teachers and additional resources, while kids who naturally needed those resources much more than us wallowed in the mire of a broken system. And now we stand on the precipice of our lives, in control of our lives, based purely and simply on luck and circumstance. If you truly believe that the demographics of Hunter represent the distribution of intelligence in this city, then you must believe that the Upper West Side, Bayside, and Flushing are intrinsically more intelligent than the South Bronx, Bedford-Stuyvesant, and Washington Heights, and I refuse to accept that. We're talking about 11-year-olds. We are deciding children's fates before they even had a chance. We are playing God, and we are losing. Kids are losing the opportunity to go to college or obtain a career because no one taught them long division or colors. Hunter is perpetuating a system in which children who contain unbridled and untapped intellect and creativity are discarded like refuse. And we have the audacity to say they deserved it because we're smarter than them." End quote. I was surprised to learn on the topic of meritocracy that word actually first entered the American lexicon because of a British author named Michael Young. And he was a member of Parliament, and in 1958 he wrote a book called The Rise of the Meritocracy. And described this new British social system, the meritocracy, as he had coined for the title. It would create a new elite by testing all the children and then segregating them, putting them in the best schools with the best resources. It sounds familiar because we do it. We do it at schools in New York, we do it with entrance exams in my home district for gifted and talented programs. And in reading about Michael Young's book, The Rise of the Meritocracy, and the system of testing children and then segregating them that he described, I was really reminded of Quest, that gifted and talented program. So students stress out about taking this test to see if they are the smartest, and then once they're in, they're part of a really insular community. They take classes with the same people for 8 years. So by the time they get to high school, they have formed their social groups around this extraordinarily small, extraordinarily tight-knit community. They call themselves Questies. And what is unfortunate is that what happens in the mind of a few people is this dichotomy between the Questies who are smart and everyone else who is stupid. As in, I've literally heard people say, oh, I had to take a class with the dumb kids, or I had to take the bus with the dumb kids, meaning the gen ed kids. And it is really Diane Ravitch's segregation by race and class, because I look at the people in Quest and I don't see any African American students, I don't see any Hispanic students. I see mainly students whose parents work at Microsoft, Boeing, Amazon, and Google, who many of them are Asian, Indian American, etc., but it's not because their parents are Asian or any other ethnicity that they're there, contrary to like Amy Chaw's triple package. The reason they're there is because their parents were highly educated at home and their parents got great jobs when they came to Washington State. And I can guarantee you that the children of Cambodian taxi drivers, for instance, who might be in the Seattle area, have a significantly harder time than getting into, say, programs like Quest. So I definitely see that segregation by race and class, even though it might not seem present and even though it might not seem as insidious as it is, because, well, it's simply a placement done by a test, and tests don't discriminate, do they? To go back to Michael Young's book, The Rise of the Meritocracy, the real kicker that I found in researching this was that Michael Young didn't set out to write a book about a utopian ideal. He actually wrote the book as a dystopia like 1984. And to me that was really insane because his book, as he said in 2001, was a satire meant to be a warning. A satire meant to be a warning, and yet we trumpet meritocracy as our shared social ideal, so clearly we did not get that memo. Our society runs on the hubris of believing that we know the ins and outs of quantifying merit. We test students with district-wide assessments, state tests, national tests, and the whole bevy of tests from the College Board, and there's the ACT as well. If someone does well in the PSAT in 11th grade, they might become a National Merit Scholar. But to me, the National Merit Scholar name is a desperate misnomer because it's a really imperfect way to determine merit, a multiple choice test that someone takes in one sitting in one day. Here's why. There are too many ways to game the system, and too many people who have everything to win if they do. You win if your parents have more financial means than others. You start off by going to a private school or a public school with better resources because it's in a good neighborhood that has higher property tax revenues. That school is richer and can afford to hire more qualified teachers, and then later on your parents can buy you brand new spanking SAT prep books and tutors and classes. And if you want, you can pay up to $50 to take the test over and over and over again, which is why I have so many friends who have taken the test 3, 4, 5 times. A poor student might ask their counselor, a counselor who might be working with upwards of 500 students in some places, depending on how large the school is and how many resources they have. They might ask for a fee waiver from that counselor just once, maybe because they're embarrassed, maybe because they aren't able to provide the exhaustive financial documentation of their family situation. And someone with comparatively infinite resources can pay as many times as they want. In all honesty, I took the SAT 3 times. So I feel a little bit ashamed to be talking about this because my lackluster 540 out of 800 on math, at least it's not an F percentage, was what I told my parents afterwards. It just wasn't that great. So I studied and I took online pre-calculus over the summer. And it was the cheapest course that I could find, but I still paid up a monthly fee that I know many students with parents struggling to find work or just barely making ends meet could never afford. I scored 100 points higher the next time I took that test, but it wasn't because I somehow got smarter or became a math genius, and the score still wasn't that great, but the point is that I had a lot of help. I had a lot of help that I know so many other people would not be able to have the time or the resources to get. And Wealthier kids even have better incentives to score higher. One of my friend's parents told her, if you get a 2350 at least, we will get you a car. A car. This is not exactly something that I think the average kid, and especially not a kid whose family is struggling financially, could ever hope to provide. You win if you're a teacher or a principal or a superintendent who has no scruples and wants to raise those test scores, maybe not with the most ethical means. I'm talking about the type of thing that happened in Georgia, where the superintendent was actually recently arrested and might face jail time because in Georgia, teachers gathered en masse to change kids' scores by erasing incorrect answers on bubble and tests, a practice that became so widespread that they would get together in rooms and order pizza and have sort of pizza parties for changing tests, which sounds like a fun time, but also really depressing. The superintendent there was, before she got arrested, lauded for improving urban schools, a bright illusion created by that cheating. But the true scandal to me is not that so many teachers participated, it's not that answers were changed, it's not that pizza was ordered or any of that. The true scandal to me is that tests were our sole measure of whether those schools were okay and whether those schools were improving. How much work does it take for someone to walk into a school and interview students and interview teachers and sit in classes and understand what a school's culture is like and whether students love learning? Those should be our true measures of whether schools are doing okay, because a school can produce the most gleaming and shiny of A's and B's and still be rotten at its core. With stressed out students who only care about doing well for someone's number or accolade, with teachers and staff who feel like they have to narrow curriculum and cut out music and arts until everything is just about doing well on the test, with a community that is not cohesive and doesn't care about the kinds of merit that cannot be measured in the arts or sciences or entrepreneurship. These are things that make schools bad, not what someone gets on a test on one day. What's more, these tests don't really mean you're smart or not. They test how well you can memorize material that is determined in important by somewhat arbitrary standards. I say arbitrary because standards for, say, getting into Harvard and Princeton used to be that you would know a certain amount of Latin and Greek, and probably another language like French or Spanish or German, and maybe if you were a really educated person, you could rattle off some important works of art in the Western world, and you've been to Europe and other great stuff like that. But today, being a meritorious scholar means high scores on critical reading and writing and mathematics. I wondered, though, as I was sitting taking my third SAT, if the heart-wrenching decision, and I mean genuinely heart-wrenching, because this was the most horrible decision of my life, if deciding whether a passage was bellicose or indignant, because I had narrowed it down to those two. I wondered how important that was, and if I picked the wrong one or the right one, if that was really a reflection of whether I was smart or not, because the difference between bellicose and indignant is really hard to find on certain passages, I can say. My gain of 100 points in the math section, as I point out, wasn't because I got smarter, it was because I had help. And the 800 on reading that felt so easy to me wasn't because I was born a genius or because I was that great, it was because I grew up hearing a lot of big words in my house. And I grew up hearing a lot of big words because I talked with adults a lot, and because I was surrounded by books that my parents had the means to buy me. How can you make up for that lost time in someone's life if they aren't hearing those big words, if they aren't reading those expensive books or whatever else it might be? How does one account for all the variables that can go into someone's life and change whether they're seen as smart or not? I don't think that we can fool ourselves into thinking that we can determine merit with a test score when there are so many things that happened to me, not because I worked hard, but because I was lucky, because I was born at the right place at the right time and had awesome parents and went to a fairly wealthy school in the suburb of Seattle. To emphasize the pervasive falsehood that we know what it means to be meritorious because of how someone does on a test, it does more than measures smartness incorrectly. It also makes us think that, to quote the author Christopher Hayes, intelligence is our highest virtue. He goes on to say, quote, "Intelligence is a vitally necessary characteristic for those with powerful positions, but it isn't just a celebration of smartness that characterizes the culture of meritocracy. It's something more pernicious, a conviction that smartness is rankable, and, like the hierarchy of wealth, never plateaus. While smartness is necessary, it is far from sufficient. Wisdom, judgment, empathy, and ethical rigor are all as important, even if those traits are far less valued. Indeed, extreme intelligence without those qualities can be extremely destructive. But empathy does not impress the same way smartness does. Smartness dazzles and mesmerizes, end quote. I found that to be really interesting and also to be true. Some of the smartest people I know are not necessarily the nicest. And I'm sure that some of you know people who are incredibly intelligent, but that you shudder to think of maybe being in a position of deciding, of being in power perhaps, or of deciding how to help people. I think that we oftentimes, by looking at what we can measure, ignore so much of what is truly valuable. Many people will say that school is supposed to be preparation for society, and society doesn't care about you being the nice guy, it cares about you being the smart person, that it hands working adults the business equivalent of Scantrons and SATs. There are competition and ranking systems at companies like JP Morgan that fire the bottom 10% of workers automatically if they don't make higher rank. Life, because of things like that, many people would say, is a rat race, and you just have to get ahead by whatever measurements are offered. But personally, and maybe this is because I'm idealistic or naive, I think that we build what we want our society to be within our schools. Because regardless of where someone ends up when they're 35 or 45, when they are a Wall Street banker or a teacher or whatever else, they go to school, at least most of them, and we can change people when they're in school. There's that quote from John Dewey at the entrance, pointing at how education is a tool for social progress, and I find that to be extremely poignant. So I want a school that doesn't hand me a rat race, because I want a society that doesn't hand me a rat race. I want a society that values me as more than a class rank, as more than a score, as more than a percentile. I've talked a lot about the problems that are evident to students, to teachers, and everyone in the education community, and I think that the question now is, how do we fix it? Well, I think that we need three things, and I've already seen these being implemented successfully in some schools across the nation. One, we need student perspective in education reform to really come to the forefront, because too often we see parents, politicians, teachers, and business interests being very well represented, but we do not see a students' union. We do not see a bunch of students striking typically. So we really need to have more of that student perspective. We also need to have greater independence for students in their learning, and we need more variety offered in high school when it comes to courses and tracks, so that every student can realize they have merit somewhere, regardless of how well they did on their SAT. So I'm a huge advocate of embracing the student perspective in education reform. And I actually, in January, I was at a conference in Michigan where I spoke to over 500 principals and superintendents there. What was absolutely great about that talk was not the weather, it was -6 degrees outside, but actually the fact that they truly valued student voice. It was the first time I had been in an education conference and had the chance to sit on a panel with other students right after my talk. And these were students who came from nearby high school, and the superintendents and principals watched in rapt attention as these students discussed their own educational experience and some things their teachers had done well, some things they wish their schools had done differently, and a variety of other things. And I knew that was the very first time that those students had been up on a stage with that many people watching and with important folks in their district watching. And on one hand I thought, whoa, this is incredible, but on the other hand I thought, this is a bloody shame that this is the first time that they have been listened to and that they have been able to express their opinions and feelings and experiences, because these are voices we need to hear more of. And I wish that that hadn't been the first time. So I think that the criticisms that we really need to hear of testing culture, of a really imperfect meritocracy and the rest, they aren't going to come from politicians who like the easy accountability that testing offers, and they aren't going to come from parents who might not be equipped to take part in either their children's education or simply the larger education reform discussion. They're going to come from students who are deeply invested, students who are sick of taking these tests over and over again, students who feel and know how they want their education to be and how their education could be better. So there's a movement, #StewVoice. Don't discount it just because it starts with a hashtag. It's actually a really awesome movement. And a University of Maryland student called Zach Malamed began #StewVoice because he wanted to give a national stage to so many students across the nation. And it actually was trending a while ago on one of its Mondays. There's a weekly Twitter chat on #StewVoice. I highly encourage you all to check it out. And that was because Secretary of Education Arne Duncan had actually decided at point it had gained so much momentum that they were able to name to join. And one person said, "Whoa, Secretary of Education is listening to us? That's pretty dope." To which he responded, "Yes, it is pretty dope." So it was a nice step forward, I thought, that people were actually listening. So things like #StuVoice are great ways for students to get their voices heard. I just wish that more teachers, more superintendents, principals, and other decision makers would be listening and could take note. A second thing that we need is more independence in learning. And so a lot of people are very skeptical of this. I've often fielded questions like, well, you're pretty curious or you're a great learner or whatever, but you're special and most students don't want to learn on their own. And I'm just like, are you crazy? But I don't actually say that part. I say, well, actually, there's an example from Massachusetts that would be contrary to that, because at Monument Mountain High School in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, a handful of teenagers in a room is really changing how many people look at independent education and what students can do. It started with a kid named Sam Levin, and he'd already done a bunch of projects at his school, like a student-run garden initiative. And he wanted to use that independence to begin a school-within-a-school program called the Independent Project. The idea was that they would gather and they would learn by asking questions within a collaborative group of their peers. So instead of spoon-feeding a set curriculum to these students, instead of saying this is what we're going to learn today and this is how we're going to learn it, then the Independent Project divided the students' time. Half of the day for an independent endeavor, like learning the piano, writing your grand novel, whatever else it might have been, and half the day would be inquiry-based learning in the natural and social sciences. Additionally, the whole group would take on a project with social significance in the community, so they would go out and actually make a change. And the students addressed questions that were pretty interesting. They ranged from, is there science behind old wives' tales, to why do we cry, to how do mice react to aromatherapy. What I also found really great as a personal bookworm was the fact that they read more books in 8 weeks than the AP Lang class their school did in the entire school year. So to anyone who says kids will read books on their own, or kids don't like to learn on their own, I like bringing up the Independent Project. Especially because these weren't all the best students at that school. They came from across the academic spectrum. They were straight A students as well as special ed. And they all piled into a spare room to paint its walls and bring in shelves and books. There's a documentary about the Independent Project on YouTube. It's 15 minutes long, and I highly encourage y'all to look it up. And what was great about it was that there was a quote from Matt Whalen, a student in the program, who said, "How can you teach someone about the world when you're isolating them from the world?" And the Independent Project truly did the opposite. Today, the project has significant momentum. That documentary has more than 30,000 views, and it's been covered in the New York Times, the Post, and Time Magazine. They're really trying to make it scalable. One of the big things on their website is, here's how you can bring the Independent Project to your school, and it has a white paper on exactly how to do that. It's something that, with administrator approval, is fairly easy to set up. And quite honestly, I can't think of a reason why an administrator would say no, although then again, I might just be idealistic and not work with that many mean administrators. And it is something that does not require additional funding from the school. It's something that doesn't require hiring an additional teacher or a coach or anything like that, the same way starting a new sports program, for instance, would. So in many ways, it's really a cost-effective way to give students the chance to take control of their own education. A psychology professor at Williams College, Susan Engel, said, "I feel that the only way to radically change our high school education in this country is to make kids feel in charge of their own education, to make them be not just the recipients, but the authors of their own educational experience." This has enormous potential. All we need to do is make it contagious. The project is best summarized by the Antoine Saint-Exupéry quote at the beginning of the documentary about the project, and it's this: "If you want to build a ship, don't drum up the men to gather wood, divide the work, and give orders. Instead, teach them to yearn for the vast and endless sea." I want this to be what education does, and I want this to be what my education is. Not the 4 years that prepare me for tests, that prepare me for whatever kinds of bubbles I'll need to fill in, but rather the 4 years that make me fall in love with learning. The 4 years that make me never fall out of love with learning in the first place, perhaps. The third thing we need is greater variety. I agree with Diane Ravitch on the idea that public schools have an obligation to produce a full, rounded, and liberal education. That idea is really getting threatened, I think, by the greater emphasis on testing because of the increased narrowing of curriculums. In a lot of schools that face budget issues, they're cutting not only recess, but also things like art programs, orchestras, and many other things. My older sister was never someone who excelled that much in her like honors and AP classes, but she excelled in orchestra. She was concert mistress, and now she goes to Manhattan School of Music. And having spent many nights helping her with really pointless projects for Honors World History, but then seeing her come alive when she went to school and performed in the orchestra, I know how valuable those programs are, not only for how students remain engaged in their community, but also for making sure that students recognize they have merit somewhere, not just that they're stupid or failing because a teacher gave them a D or an F in some class. At Bard College Early High School in New York, one student, Sam, said, "The day that the course catalog comes out at my school is like Christmas morning. My friends and I run through the hall, frantically circling all of the classes that we want to take. And instead of worrying about choosing between AP English and AP Government, we're excited to see that novels of Fyodor Dostoevsky and a political science course called Equality are being offered. During the last 2 years of high school, I was able to choose from a plethora of on-site college courses taught by college professors, many of whom have doctorate degrees in their field of study. BHSEC also emphasizes discussion rather than lecture as its method of teaching, and expects that students will develop critical thinking tools by challenging one another's ideas. We need a shift away from investing in students' test scores and toward funding programs like BHSEC that challenge students to critically think. As a BHSEC student, discussing notions of Lockean consent with a professor who had just published a book on religious toleration in Israel was exponentially more valuable to me than learning how to answer a question on an AP or Regents exam. Learning how to build an argument by examining contradicting viewpoints meant more to me than learning how to construct a standard 5-paragraph essay. All of the students, teachers, and parents in my school also embrace a love for learning beyond exam scores and report cards. I have frequently had conversations about Kafka with friends over peanut butter and jelly sandwiches at lunch, end quote. When I read that, I thought, this shouldn't be an opportunity that is limited only to students who can produce the scores necessary to get into a school like that. This is an opportunity that all students need to receive. That's an opportunity that I wish I had, that I could take a class like novels of Fyodor Dostoevsky or Equality. Because what I see is that students, when they have greater choice, when they're actually deciding that they want to take something because they're interested in it instead of because it looks good on a transcript, then they come in with less discipline issues because they actually want to be there. And wanting to be somewhere is like the best way I can think of to make sure that people are happy and are working together in a cohesive way. Now, another thing, though, is that variety doesn't necessarily just mean more and better academic courses. It doesn't just mean having cool courses like the Dostoevsky novels taught by college professors. It also means that educational institutions can house more options, that they can house arts learning and trade learning, where students can be excellent at the sciences or dance or become culinary geniuses. In Des Moines, Iowa, they have something called Central Campus, which houses a magnet school that is more academically focused, as well as career education for everything from education to transportation. There's a recent cover story in Time magazine focusing on a 6-year high school that gave students the chance to have a tech-focused education, and then they had guaranteed jobs and paid internships at IBM right afterwards. The students, they actually quoted some saying that they were motivated by the connection to industry and the real-world context of their learning. The students in that school were almost universally African American. They came from a relatively poor area of the city, but the career-focused education they were offered, I don't think that should be in any way segregating by race and class, because there's no reason that a bunch of less wealthy children with a different skin color, because they're not in the suburbs, because they're not in a wealthy school, in a good district or whatever, that they should not be offered top-line academic courses. And by that same token, there's no reason that because I'm half Asian and because I go to a suburban school, that I should not also, that a vocational track might not be just as good for me. And unfortunately, that's what I'm seeing right now is happening, that there's this immense focus on everyone go to college unless you are someone who could benefit from getting a relatively higher paying job right away. I think that everyone can benefit from an education that has more of a real world grounding. I think that everybody could benefit from having better and more academic courses, and I think that everyone could also benefit from seeing more connections in their learning and things that actually happen in the world. Those aren't solutions that are limited to rich white kids in a suburb or poor minority children in an urban setting to create sort of a dichotomy there. But I think that too much of the focus on solutions exclusively for urban schools, for instance, don't take into account the fact that a good solution in education should not just be a solution for one group of students. It should be a solution that works for many groups of students. There should be nothing stigmatizing or segregating about an education that focuses on real-world components as much as it does on academics. Student voice affecting decisions on how we change schools and independence in learning, variety in the courses and tracks that are offered to students may not seem like direct challenges to high-stakes tests, because in truth they're not direct challenges to high-stakes tests. Instead, they challenge something far deeper, which is the underlying ideal that merit is one singular score. And I think that student voice, independence, and variety help to promote the idea that the strength of a society comes from the diversity of ways in which we define merit and reward it. No economy of diverse individuals can flourish if we do not find merit in wider expressions of excellence beyond smartness in academics. As we learn to recognize and reward the value of a broader spectrum of human talents and skills, we in turn expand, advance, and diversify our financial systems, the richness of our shared way of life, and the quality of our existence. It starts with us, and I really believe we can do it. So, thank you. You're somehow there. So I would, as far as motivated students and motivated teachers being necessary for project-based learning, I would agree with motivated teachers, but I would say that I have seen students, so in comp sci engineering, for example, that class I'm in, some of the students who walk in there, actually there are like 3 or 4 special ed students, so it's a very like broad spectrum of kids who are in that class with me. And then there's like one of my friends who was one of those National Merit Scholars, and he's like a robotics kid and everything, and he's super good at everything. But he works at a table with like everyone else, and what I've seen is that the kids who you might assume would kind of slack off, the kids who have more behavioral issues, who have like specialized learning plans and everything, they've been pretty dedicated, and I think it's because whenever you have a team and you have a feeling of responsibility, then I think there is a little bit more investment. And I think that if you have motivated teachers, then most students can find something that they're interested in a project, and if they're not interested in the end product, like they're not interested in seeing a quadricopter fly. Personally, I would say what's wrong with that kid. But if you're not interested in seeing a quadricopter fly, then you can at least be interested in not letting other people down, or you can be interested in not letting a teacher that you truly love and care about down. You can be interested in maybe reading the books that would help other people. So it's not necessarily that a kid has to be motivated in the sense of walking into class every day with like, oh, I'm going to be all in this. If they can find something that is at least interesting, I think that's the buy-in that was required for most of my classmates in that class, who otherwise wouldn't really be described as motivated students.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point, and that both the student and the teacher are products of their culture. So those students maybe have been in special ed for a while, and so they've been accustomed to the culture of low expectations there. And then even more, however, that can always be changed, but less forgivable is the teachers who are also part of that culture of low expectations of the students. Then learning's not going to happen. We were talking here about there's something in New York City. There's some schools that have an exception from the Regents exam that most high schools have to take, and they are able to use something called portfolio-based assessment, which I'm sure happens in other parts of the country too. But there's a group of schools here that has a exception from the state to be able to use that method of assessment rather than taking the Regents exams. And I don't know if there's been studies that try to compare them somehow. There probably have been, but but the idea is that everything a student does in their 4 years, which I think matches with a lot of things in your talk, everything the student does in 4 years, the written work in classes, maybe papers or something like that, but also maybe things they did in the community, artistic work, presentations, like everything they've done becomes part of their portfolio work. So it's about the whole person, and then that's what they're evaluated on.
Yeah, and I think that moving toward that would make a lot of students really happy, because especially, so someone who, I do okay on tests generally, not so much on the math portions, but like I definitely am able to express myself better when I'm able to give a much wider selection of work, when I'm able to say, like, include the text of a speech I've written with maybe an interview I've done, all kinds of stuff like that, debates I've gone to. That I feel represents me far better as a student and as someone who loves learning than, you know, my SAT, for instance. Yeah, by far.
But just as a follow-up, like that method sounds very attractive to people who are fed up maybe with standardized testing and its problems. But when I raised it at a large testing conference here with a lot of the people who designed the test, the response was that it's so time intensive, it takes so many hours on part of students, part of teachers, so there's plenty of people, especially within this huge testing industry, that are making a lot of money. There's plenty of complaint or reasons, I think, that people can cite saying it's not practical or things like that, but I don't know if that's a full answer to.
I do, yeah, I completely agree with the idea that as far as efficiency goes, as far as simple amount of labor the teacher has to put in evaluating students, then something that you can just put in a machine that gives you this right answer, this wrong answer, that is the most effective. If I were a teacher who got like 4 hours of sleep every single night, and I was stressed out preparing for lessons every day, then I would think, okay, if it's a choice between like 2 hours of sleep versus something that is efficient, I think that that's a really unfortunate thing that happens because of, I mean, not only financial issues, but also, and so one of my friends at summer camp also was like, what, you don't get grades, but like, why does anyone do anything? And I burst into laughter at that because of how like incredulous he was, and they just said, well, we really just want to improve, and we get a sense of how much we've improved or what we need to work on from that written feedback. Oh, yeah.
When you're calling for more of a student perspective in education reform, so, and I was just thinking that's different than, like, say, student voice at the school level. So is there a connection between those two? Like, how what do you think, like, student voice in terms of student government, student engagement with administration at like a high school level is versus maybe a small number of students engaging with superintendents or secretary of ed or something like that?
I think that it's very important in both levels. I've been, I guess, more active on the student voice and education reform thing because I see it as most lacking in the national stage. I've seen more examples of principals who actually like call people in to ask how they're doing it at the local level. But I do think it's extraordinarily important at both. What I'm seeing right now is that people assume that maybe student councils, ASBs, those kinds of organizations are providing student voice at the local level, but generally student councils just like schedule dances. They're not exactly weighing in, and even at the college level, there isn't a whole lot of this two-way interaction. I can remember being in an info session for one college I was interested in asking, so like what is the student voice like in the culture? Are students really regarded as having as much to offer? And the admissions officer just kind of looks at me like, what kind of question is that? Not in so many words, obviously, because everyone else was asking about the food. And I think that it needs to be, I think that if it starts at a national level, then a lot of principals in school districts and superintendents in school districts will take note as well, hopefully. But I think that it really starts with individuals who are willing to convene groups of students and listen to them, groups of students that are diverse, that really range from all grade levels and from all grades, I guess, as far as 4.0s to 0s. So, yeah, I think it's very important at both levels. And any last questions? Or comments? Okay, well, I've learned so much from talking to you guys today, and I really do appreciate you coming here. I've been continuing to do a great deal of thinking about merit, test scores, and particularly how it affects student culture and student attitudes towards learning. So I would love to hear from any of you after this presentation. Please do
Twitter?
Email me or follow me on Twitter. It's Adora SB. And I highly encourage all of you to also join the hashtag #StudVoice Twitter chat and check out some of the discussion going on there. Thank you again.